and in Magrinitsa, and I'm honored to be here this evening to talk with you about this important piece of lost history. Before I begin, I would like to give you a brief background about myself and about my grandfather, John Kamichas. I was born and raised in Orlando, Florida, USA. I have a bachelor's degree from Lenoir-Rhyne University in Hickory, North Carolina, and a master's from Western Carolina University in Colony, North Carolina. I have taught history for 15 years. I trace my Greek heritage through my paternal grandfather, Yannis Kamichas, who was born and raised in Pori. He moved to the United States in 1916. He was a restaurant owner in Orlando, Florida, and he lived there from 1923 until his death in 1994. For other lectures I have presented on the Orlando Plan, I normally start with an overview of Greece during the 1940s. However, tonight I feel that my knowledge, which is only through history books and letters written to my grandfather during the Nazi occupation, would not honor those of you here tonight whose families lived through these horrible times. Therefore, I will begin with the inception of the Orlando Plan. In the spring of 1946, a year after the end of World War II in Europe, my grandfather, John Kamichas, received a letter from his brothers still living in Greece. In this letter, my grandfather learned of the conditions that still persisted in Volos. Letters received from his brothers George and Stavros in April of 1946 described severe conditions in the city. Money was worthless and food was badly needed. German soldiers had wrecked the waterfront installations around the bay, leaving boats stranded in the harbor. George wrote of the devastation in the farming areas of Volos, burned crops, dead livestock, and destroyed roads. After reading these letters, my grandfather realized that without help, the people of Volos would die of starvation waiting for the crops due in June and July. Also in April of 1946, President Truman urged the U.S. public to help the starving people of Europe. Truman recalled how during the war, individual Americans had adopted orphans from other countries, and he encouraged Americans to continue this practice. After hearing this radio speech, Mrs. Margaret Bowie, a resident of Orlando, decided to expand upon this idea. Mrs. Bowie, a businesswoman and a member of the Business Professional Women's Club, realized that adopting an entire city would save more lives than attempting to work with individual orphans. She sent a proposal to the Orlando JC's Club recommending that the city of Orlando be the first city in the country to adopt an entire city in Europe, feeding and clothing the entire population for 3 months, at the end of which time the crops would be ready to harvest. This adopted city would be equal in size and population to Orlando, known as the City Beautiful. On 22 April 1946, the Orlando JCs accepted Mrs. Bowie's challenge and began the development of the Orlando Plan. Directed by the JCs, the Orlando Plan also received support from civic groups, government organizations, churches, schools, and other clubs in the Orlando area. The objective of the Orlando Plan was to collect canned or dried food and clothing to send to a European city chosen by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. In addition to the JC's commitment, Major General Donald Wilson, Commanding General Headquarters, AAF Proving Ground Command, pledged the support and cooperation of the local Army base by agreeing to store all the food in the base warehouse. The Jaycees Warehousing Committee Chairman, Cecil Ferris, would make certain that the food stored in the warehouses was sorted, packed, and shipped to the appropriate city. With the logistics determined, the Orlando Jaycees now face the task of choosing a city to adopt. The Jaycees asked for help from the offices of Elizabeth Carr, UNRRA staff member in Washington, D.C., as well as from Florida Senator Claude Red Pepper, to help them determine which European city faced the greatest danger from starvation. An unexpected illness of Mrs. Carr compelled the Jaycees to make its own selection, and on April 25, 1946, the Jaycees announced that the Greek city of Volos would receive relief supplies from the city of Orlando. During a special banquet, the Jaycees made a public announcement that Volos, Greece was their adoptive choice. My grandfather, John Comegis, thanked the Jaycees for choosing his native town and gave a narrative description of the village that showed the similarities between Volos and Orlando. Volos is located in northeastern Greece on the Gulf. Its climate is much colder than Orlando, but both the farmers in Orlando and in Volos grew grapes, oranges, and other truck crops. The population of both cities at that time was 48,000. My grandfather was no stranger to relief efforts for Greece. In response to letters from family, friends, and strangers, he spent hundreds of his own dollars for clothes, food, medical supplies, and freight costs in order to help those trapped in Nazi-occupied Greece. My grandfather's sister, Persephone Volovini, and her husband George wrote in 1945 that after 4 years of tyranny, starvation, and fear, the family did not know if it would live to see another day. Before the war, they had owned a prospering seaside resort, but when the Germans came, they took everything and tore down all of the businesses by the seashore. God granted us our lives, but we lost everything, wrote George Volovini. In closing, the letter pleaded for help. The family noted that John was living far from the terrible war, and that those who had nothing prayed to God prayed that God would help him have a prosperous business so that he might send money to those in need. Later in 1946, the Volovini family wrote thanking John for the money that he had given them. Bad news followed, however, as my grandfather's brother George had suffered from a heart attack or stroke brought about by the pressures of the war. They had taken George to every doctor in town, but none could help him. A photographer by the name of Kostas Zimmeris also wrote to my grandfather in 1944. In his letter, Mr. Zimmeris described the hardships that he experienced during Nazi occupation. The bombs destroyed many homes, and I, with my family, 4 children and wife, hid in the woods, chased by the German Gestapo, because we love so much the freedom of our beautiful country. The letter continued with a plea for old clothing in exchange for photographs that Kostas would later send. Growing up, a photograph of my grandfather's boyhood home hung in my grandparents' living room. I recall asking my grandmother about the photograph. All she ever said was that it was the house that my grandfather had grown up in, and that the picture was taken by a friend. What she failed to tell me was the fact that this friend's life had been saved by my grandfather, and that the picture was a thank you for the help that my grandfather had given to his family. With the inception of the Orlando Plan, however, my grandfather was now able to work with the JCs and other civic organizations to help even more people in Volos. When the Orlando Plan first started, the Orlando Morning Sentinel owner and editor Martin Anderson sent Associated Press writer L.S. Sochakalis to Volos, Greece, to report back with news. His articles conveyed the hardships in Volos. When Nazi troops first arrived, they packed and shipped items from Volos' textile mills, cigarette factories, and iron foundries back to Germany. Nazi troops also took personal property for shipment back to Germany. What personal property they did not steal, they destroyed. The actual physical property damages in Volos was estimated at that time in the millions of US dollars. Chaklos also reported of the horrors inflicted by the Nazi soldiers. Hundreds of Volos residents died in the streets from starvation in the winter of 1941 and 1942. At the start of occupation, Volos had a population of 50,000 people. Records note that in 1940, 169 people died. In 1941, the death toll climbed to 1,013. And by 1942, 2,585 people died of starvation. But starvation was not the only killer in Volos. So was German vindictiveness. Reports surfaced regarding numerous instances of Germans executing anywhere between 1 to 20 villagers at a time for various offenses against the Nazis. In the spring of 1942, following an attack on German officers by the Andartes, Nazi soldiers gathered 12 villagers, including women and children, and took them to the churchyard on Mount Pelion. There within the sacred walls, these people were executed. Reports also told of the damages inflicted on Volos during bombing raids. The heaviest bombing in Volos happened when the Luftwaffe was attempting to destroy the airfields in Larissa and inflicted heavy damages on nearby towns, including Volos. During these terrible years, many Greeks survived on chickpeas, bread, olive oil, and small amounts of meat. Their daily caloric intake totaled 600 calories. Many items such as vitamins, food, and clothing sent to Greece by the Swiss Red Cross sat in warehouses due to lack of transportation. By the spring of 1942, the Nazis had confiscated every automobile, and in order to distribute relief supplies, the UN workers were using wagons drawn by mules or oxen. By the time the citizens of Orlando read the stories regarding these hardships, 6,000 cans of food waited for volunteers to carry them to the Army warehouse. While this was a good effort, 12 times this amount was needed to fill the 5 boxcars promised by the JCs when the Orlando Plan started. Albert W. Ayer, a volunteer working full-time with the JCs, sorting and packing food, said that Orlando must increase its efforts or Volos residents would die within the 90 days given for the drive. Mr. Ayer estimated that 35,000 cans were needed per week in order to fill 5 boxcars. That meant that a daily donation of 5 cans of food for every man, woman, and child in the city of Orlando was needed in order to keep the Orlando Plan going. Civic organizations and citizens of Orlando increased their efforts to help Volos. Reverend Fayette Hall, president of the Orange County Pastors Association, said that pastors belonging to his association would either use the Orlando plan as the basis for their sermons or urge its support from the pulpit. In addition, Reverend Hall made plans to install receptacles in church entranceways where churchgoers could drop extra cans of food. Through letters to the editor of the Orlando Morning Sentinel, citizens urged support for the Orlando plan. One of my favorite is from a man simply calling himself Uncle Abe, from a village outside of Orlando called Mount Dora. Uncle Abe coined the term Volos for Volos in a letter about daylight savings time, lamenting the fact that the United States legislative branch had voted to adopt daylight savings time. Uncle Abe wrote, "But I am satisfied just so long as we don't go back to telling time by a sundial, or as the old Greeks used, I done read about what says, 'What is the time?' by that darn coconut shell." Vittles for Volos is my slogan. Uncle Abe's slogan stuck and became the rallying cry for the Orlando plan. Supermarkets and restaurants also worked to help the Orlando plan. Leading grocers in the area agreed to match can for can the contributions gathered by their customers. My grandfather started 2 campaigns at his restaurant, the Southland, that were later used by other restaurant owners. The Southland placed a display of canned food near the cashier, my grandmother, Geneva Camichas, with the wholesale prices listed. As the diner paid their bill, a poster encouraged them to add enough for the purchase of 1 or more cans of food at the wholesale price. If the poster did not work, I'm pretty sure that my grandmother could either convince the customer or shame them into buying at least 1 can. The other campaign started at the Southland invited diners to spend their dessert money on canned food for Volos. Having eaten my grandparents' cooking growing up, I can tell you that giving up a dessert was no easy feat. The largest contribution came from 2 minority and disenfranchised sectors of Orlando, that being African Americans and women. African Americans contributed both labor and food to the Orlando plan. Winter Garden Junior High School, an all-African American school, collected 1,800 cans of food. An African American Civic Club, unnamed in the Orlando Sentinel and unknown in the annals of Orlando history, collected 500 cans of food. The largest contribution, however, came from an African American high school. In less than 1 week, 800 African American students at Jones High School collected 5,000 cans of food for Volos. This equaled 7 cans per student. In order to promote the canned food drive, the students conducted contests between each class. When the drive lagged, class presidents took money from class treasuries to purchase canned food. JC's chairman, Burton Thornall, called this the finest civic gesture he had ever witnessed. It is possible, and I am speculating here, that this fundraising effort may be a direct result of earlier actions by my grandfather. During the Depression in the United States, my grandfather gave free meals to poor people in Orlando, including African Americans who were not only poor, but because of Jim Crow laws, were not allowed to eat in white establishments. These people would arrive in the alley behind the restaurant after the dinner hour and receive a hot meal of meat, vegetables, and bread. In addition, my grandfather hired several African Americans as kitchen help during the 1930s and 40s. I like to think that these same people and their families were repaying his kindness by assisting his family and friends trapped in Greece. Housewives of Orlando proved the backbone of the Orlando plan. J.C.'s chairman, Clem Brossier, called the campaign mainly a woman's battle because housewives purchased food for the family, thereby making them the ones to ensure that donations arrive at the drop-off points. The Women's Council, chaired by Mrs. Edna Giles Fuller, represented 37 women's organizations in Orlando, all of which rallied behind the Orlando plan. Their motto was, "Buy 2 cans, give 1." The largest contribution by the women of Orlando happened in May of 1946. George Burke, manager of the Dixie Freeze, which was a slaughterhouse, donated 2 steers. After slaughtering and dressing down these animals, the amount of beef totaled 601 pounds. Mrs. Mary Jane Alex and Mrs. M.J. Moss, both of the Women's Council Committee, asked volunteers to assist in the canning of the meat as well as other foodstuffs. On May 15, 1946, women volunteers from the Red Cross, the Cirrhosis Club, and other women's civics groups met at the Country Kitchen, which was a meat packing factory. Each woman brought her own set of knives, frying pans, aprons, and a lunch. The project started at 9 a.m. and ended at 5 p.m. It is unclear the total number of cases of food that were actually canned by these women, but reports from the Orlando Morning Sentinel state that the women canned 792 cases of food, including meat, stew, honey, pears, and peas. Despite the best efforts by the Orlando clubs to reach the goal of 5 boxcars of food, Orlando citizens lagged in their efforts to keep the plan going. On 21 May 1946, J.C.'s president, Clem Brossier, announced the end of the Orlando plan. He called for one last concerted effort, which would last for 1 week. His goal was to fill 3 boxcars of food. At this same time, reports from the UN told the JCs that wheat supplies to Volos were about to be cut. The UN was giving 1,100 calories per day to each citizen of Volos, but they were unable to sustain this amount. The UN report stated that Volos citizens needed at least 2,000 calories per day. According to the report, and I quote, "Volos is on the edge of starvation, and to survive, immediate assistance must be forthcoming from an outside source." UNRRA Director in Volos, Nicholas G. Traper, said that 80% of the children and a large number of adults suffered from malnutrition. He estimated that the citizens of Volos needed 5,100 tons of food monthly, and that April, May, and June wheat shipments would fall short by 40%. This news inspired a renewal from civic organizations to keep the Orlando plan going through the first week of June. Orlando residents began to donate money, something previously discouraged by I.A. Mayfield, treasurer of the JCs. Once these monetary donations began to come in, the JCs agreed to hold all monies until the end of the plan, at which time they would purchase canned food from Orlando's wholesale grocers, with the money being divided equally among the stores. By the end of the plan, the cash contributions totaled nearly $1,300 US. The last fundraising effort for Volos took place in June of 1946. Business leaders John H. Ganzel, Mrs. Sue Bussell, Sam Shiver, Hy Roth, Harry Pappas, I.A. Mayfield, and John Kamichis formed a committee to sponsor a benefit baseball game. The two teams were the league-leading Orlando Senators and the Daytona Beach Islanders. Volos night at Tinker Field, the home of the Orlando Senators, which has been torn down, was an overwhelming success. 300 advanced seats were sold at the price of $1 per regular seat and $1.50 for box seats. In addition to the fans paying, all the players and all the ballpark employees had to pay to enter the stadium. After operating costs, all proceeds went to the Orlando plant. 1,150 fans showed up at rain-soaked Tinker Field to watch the Senators defeat the Islanders by a score of 21-4. Business manager John H. Ganzel presented a check for $1,000 to the J.C.'s Volos Fund. With the end of the baseball game came the end of the Orlando plan. The food was shipped shortly after the game, but it was not until September of 1947 that the official calculations of the food drive were available. Orlando residents had collected a total of 45,726 pounds of food for Volos. It is estimated that 60,000 people were saved from starvation by the Orlando plant. Volos residents were provided one meal